This is NatSec Matters.
I'm Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Glenn Korn, a former podcast guest and a foreign policy expert with over 34 years of experience in U.S. intelligence, defense, and foreign affairs communities. Mr. Korn previously served as a senior executive in the CIA and has completed 4 tours as a chief of station in the Middle East and Eurasia. Glenn Korn joins us today to discuss developments in Ukraine and in the shifting dynamics with Russia and the policy outlook for the region. Stay with us as we speak with Glenn Korn. Welcome back to NatSec Matters.
Thank you for having me back as a guest.
Well, we thought you did a great job last time and our listeners approved, but you've also recently been to Ukraine. And that's of intense interest, of course, to our listeners. And we really want to get your readout of the trip. Now, you were there in your capacity as a private citizen, a former national security official, an academic, and other associations that you have. And you had an interesting series of meetings, as I understand it, in Kyiv, and then you really went downrange a little bit. But let me just start off with just a simple question. Who's winning the war?
Simple question. Thanks, Michael. I think we all know nobody wins in a war, right? And unfortunately, I would say the Ukrainians, since 2014, have been holding their own against a much larger enemy. Russia started its invasion of Ukraine in 2014. I'd say it's conventional invasion of Ukraine. It's aggression against Ukraine. The Ukrainians are holding the line along the front. They continue to deny the Russians the ability to take large swaths of land. They themselves had taken some territory in Kursk Oblast. They've lost some of that territory, not all of it, although the Russians claim they're completely out. I don't think that is correct. I would say that the Ukrainians want this war to end. There's no doubt about it. They've paid a terrible price to protect their sovereignty, but they're ready to continue fighting, and they don't want to end the war if it means surrendering their sovereignty or their way of life or their right to determine how they want to live and not allow Vladimir Putin to dictate to them how they should live.
Yeah. So would you call it a stalemate, or is it that the Russians are making, I've heard statistics of they're only making either miles of progress per day or per week, or how should we think about it?
Maybe you could say incremental, small scale advances in some parts of along the front. Of course, that doesn't take into, that's like if you're talking about militarily, who's taking, how many meters or kilometers of territory. But in the bigger picture, I think the Ukrainians in a way are winning because, one, although it's not talked a lot here about this here, the Russian economy is in a terrible state. Mm-hmm. The Russians are suffering. If you see, during our visit, the Russians celebrated their Victory Day. The international response to that celebration, I'm sure Vladimir Putin wanted a lot more attention and more dignitaries to come. That did not happen. In fact, the leaders of several European countries went to Kiev to mark that day, given Ukraine's own role in defending Europe from fascism during the Second World War, and now, of course, defending Europe from fascism during this war. They had a much better contingent of visitors than Moscow was able to pull in on Red Square for their Victory Day celebration. And I have to say, too, having lived in Russia and spent a lot of time studying this issue, it's really sad to see what Putin has done when you think about all the veterans that died, or that all the Russians and Ukrainians, Uzbeks, Azerbaijanis that suffered fighting against Hitler during the Second World War, because in my own view, President Putin is behaving like Hitler behaved during that war.
Okay.
Right? So I always say when you pass a monument, let's say in Ukraine, there are a lot of war monuments honoring those that fell, died during the Second World War. We have to remember that what's happening now is they're basically desecrating the graves of those people, in my opinion.
Who fought? All right. So in effect, the Ukrainians are winning by virtue of the fact that the Russians are not winning, and that their economy is taking a beating, and that their casualties are very, very large. And let's explore that in just a minute. But just to drill in a little bit more on your experience talking to Ukrainians, how's the morale? I mean, do they secretly really, really hope that Trump can succeed and get them a ceasefire? Or are they just ready to keep going because they feel like if they quit or did a fake pause, they would just be passing along the war to their grandchildren?
They don't secretly support some kind of ceasefire. They openly support it as long as it includes some guarantees for their security going forward, and it is, in their view, a just settlement to the conflict. So I think when they say just, the majority of Ukrainians I know and speak with say that they don't want to give up territory that Russia's currently occupying. There may be some territories they're willing to give up or accept that the Russians will occupy for a certain period of time. The example that I always refer to is, the Baltic states, which were occupied by the Soviet Union after the Second World War until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. never recognized those countries as being part of the Soviet Union. We recognize them as being independent countries. The Ukrainians are I think they're saying, for example, Crimea, they're willing to accept that the Russians will occupy Crimea for a certain period of time, but they are never going to diplomatically accept that it's not their territory because it is their territory.
Yeah. So they would prefer a formulation, if they had to, where the United States says something about, well, the Russians control it, but we're not formally issuing recognition that it's Russian sovereign territory. They could live with that. They just don't want us to adopt the Russian position that it's Russian.
I think that is correct. And it probably goes to the pre-2022 situation after 2014 when the Russians were occupying those territories. But the United States position was that was Ukrainian territory. And most of the international community agreed with that. So I think they're looking for that. They're hopeful that President Trump can find a solution, can bring a ceasefire. By the way, they welcome the idea of the rare earth minerals deal. That was signed just as we were arriving, on the eve of our arrival. A lot of positive response to that because Ukrainians were saying and are saying, we want the U.S. side by side with us. We want U.S. business and investment. And if this agreement will enable that, that's very good for us because we need the help from the U.S. and the experience of U.S. businesses. And they think that that is part of the guarantee because I think their assessment is that if U.S. business is heavily invested in Ukraine, we'll have an interest in not letting the Russians do another land grab in 2 to 5 years, which that is their experience. And if you ask the Chechens and you ask some of the other neighbors of Russia, that's their experience with the Russians.
So that would be part of an agreement and for a ceasefire or an ensuing so-called peace agreement after a ceasefire. And when we talk about security assurances, it usually goes a breakdown like Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. The Russians are likely object to what people shorthand as NATO in Ukraine, which usually means the French, the British, and maybe some German troops there as a tripwire force. But security assurance longer term could mean continued military assistance from the United States and the Europeans and more involvement from the United States economically because that would presumably be accompanied by some U.S. protectors, be it U.S. troops, probably not, but some sort of contract force. Is that what people are talking about when you talk about security assurances in Kyiv and in Ukraine writ large, or is this just sort of a Washington formation?
No, there are a number of variations of what people are asking for. Some people still want a NATO membership. Some people want U.S. troops on the ground. Some people want European troops on the ground. I think realistically, one of the members of our delegation, the head of our delegation, who's a very, very smart man, said, multiple times, and I agree with them, that the Ukrainians have demonstrated the ability to deter the Russians and stop the Russians themselves. They just need help maintaining and building their armed forces and their intelligence capabilities to monitor and deter any future Russian aggression against them. And by the way, I should say that not one, I've been in Ukraine now, I think 6 times since I retired in 2023. Not one time did I hear one Ukrainian talk about marching or taking any Russian territory, marching on Moscow. They're just talking about liberating their country and protecting their country.
So before we get to how Russia's economy is suffering and the casualties they're taking, what were the other main takeaways from your trip?
Main takeaways. There is a level of infighting that's happening in the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian society, which is greater than I saw before. That over the last year has started to increase. There's a lot of debate about, I think people are jockeying for position in the event that there's a ceasefire, and then there's a debate on whether they should have elections and then when the elections. I don't think it's a debate on should they have elections, it's when. And there's a lot of infighting that's going on over this issue, which is natural, but it's something I think we have to watch. The Ukrainians have to be very careful about. One of the Ukrainians who we know is a general who said something very, I thought, significant. When we were down in Kharkiv, he was one of the commanders who pushed the Russians out of Kharkiv in 2022. And he said, listen, we've never lost to the Russians. We lose to ourselves because we start fighting with ourselves and we allow the Russians to buy one of us off, drive division, divide and conquer. And so how the Ukrainians are going to maintain unity in the future is significant. And I always tell people, even when there will be a ceasefire, let's hope that it happens soon. Let's say it happens this summer. When the let's say the large scale fighting stops or the conventional fighting stops, the war is not over for the Ukrainians because the Russians will continue to do what they've done since 1991, which is their active measures, gray space attacks and efforts to undermine Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, stability in Ukraine, and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people. So the Ukrainians are well aware of this. I think we in the West need to be well aware of it. And it's another reason why, in my own opinion, we need to be committed to helping the Ukrainians in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a huge political question going forward. Did any of the Ukrainians seem relieved because in recent weeks, the president of the United States seemed to be more critical of Vladimir Putin than he had been at the beginning of the administration?
Yes. When we were there in February, it's when the relationship took a significant downturn. There was a lot of concern then about what was happening, where the relationship was going. The meeting between, the kind of impromptu meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, the one-on-one in the Vatican, did a lot, I think, to help and to give people hope. My understanding is that was a very positive meeting.
Yeah.
Right? And it's given a lot of people hope that, there is still a dialogue and a healthy dialogue between Kiev and Washington. I think the Ukrainians are getting anxious that the president is allowing Putin, in their view, to string us along. While we were there, Putin announced he wanted to have talks in Istanbul.
Yeah.
Right? He dangled this out there. The president of the United States said, he was in the region, and he said, I may come if President Putin comes. Zelensky went to Ankara, and he was ready to meet. Unfortunately, President Putin did not go. And in my own view, that's a clear sign that he's not serious about peace. He sent a lower-level team to negotiate that made belligerent statements like, we can fight for another 30 years, like we did against the Swedes.
Right.
And when I hear that, I also would like to mention that is true. The Russians have a high threshold for pain, but there have also been plenty of cases when their ill-advised military campaigns backfire on them and cause the downfall of regimes. So you can just look at the First World War, what happened to the Tsarist government. You can look at the impact of the Afghan war on the Soviet Union and the Soviet system and what happened a couple of years after the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan. So the Russians, this myth that the Russians are invincible and can fight forever, I think is a myth. And as an American, I hope we all understand that we can outlast the Russians if we just accept that, it's going to be, it may be 30 years. We did it in the Cold War and we won.
Well, let's drill down on that right now, because I noticed that when General Cavoli testified recently, he sort of changed the mood music on Russia. He said they have successfully converted into a wartime economy. And by that, I think he means a lot of the other work that the commercial sector in Russia did has just been completely retooled and revamped to continue to churn out war-making materials. And to Cavoli, I think he would agree the United States needs to stay in the fight with continued military and intelligence assistance. But when are we going to see something tangible that the Russians are running out of? They seem to be able to continue to put troops in the field, and they continue, it seems, to replace the tanks and personnel carriers that are always blown up.
Right. The Russians have moved their economy onto a wartime footing. I think that they're fudging publicly the data on how well their economy is doing and how this move that they've done is impacting, the war is impacting the Russian economy. I do believe, my understanding is based on many discussions with people who are following this issue closely, that the Russians they are not able to invest in some of the civilian, non-military priorities and projects that they were looking at before, which will hurt Russia long term. The Russians, to your question, I think that we've just got to stick with this. The Russians can't go on forever. Mm-hmm. And Putin is trying to convince us that he is in a much stronger position than we are, that he has the ability to outlast, Ukraine and the U.S. and the West. I do not think that is true. And I think eventually people around Putin will start saying, okay, the president of the United States gave you an opportunity to end this and to end our isolation, and you didn't take it. That is a failure in leadership.
Yeah.
Right? That's what happened with Assad in Syria, and he's now no longer the dictator in Damascus. It's possible that can happen in Russia, and I hope that the American people understand that what we have to do to help the Ukrainians is not a huge investment. And in many ways, it's been beneficial for the U.S. and the U.S. economy, and it's helped us address significant problems we had with our defense industrial complex, which was in major need of kind of reinvigoration.
Yeah. So one question I haven't heard people talking about in Washington yet is just how long the military assistance, how long can we continue to do it without re-upping through the Congress, assuming we could even get the Congress to do that. Did you hear anything about that in Ukraine? Are they running out of stuff? I know they want more Patriot missile batteries and the like, but is there anything else you heard that they really need?
They need pretty much everything if you ask them. On the Patriots, my understanding is that we agreed to, I think there was a deal with the Israelis where they were shifting Patriot batteries and I think ammunition to the Ukrainians. Absolutely essential because the Russians continue to hit, Kiev and other major cities, civilian infrastructure, kill civilians on a regular basis, right? So they need air defense systems. They need electronic warfare assistance, capabilities. They definitely need assistance on the intelligence front, in my assessment. They've done a lot themselves, and they are pretty impressive. But my understanding is we're continuing to provide assistance. And in terms of Congress, let's focus on the fact that Lindsey Graham has now got this sanctions package ready to go, and my understanding has a lot of support for that.
Yeah, 71 votes.
Yeah, and I saw an interview where Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said that they've warned the Russians that this is coming if Putin doesn't really come to the table in a sincere manner.
Well, this gets back to his economy, and I feel like everyone has said the Russian economy is doing poorly, but nothing tangible ever seems to happen to cripple it. So I've sort of settled on a shorthand of, I think they have doomed themselves in the medium to long term to be able to meaningfully diversify or grow their economy on anything other than war material and oil and gas. But it seems to keep chugging along as long as they're getting receipts from oil. And I understand Lindsey Graham's bill would try to cut some of that off. But what do you hear on the state? And you've worked over there. What do you hear on the state of the Russian economy? It feels like they can go on forever.
Well, let's look at the Cold War, right? There was this, I remember in the 70s being a young American and hearing all the experts, the academics talk about the Soviet system was invincible. It was on the rise. It was the most powerful system. The U.S. economy was in shambles. The U.S. system was in decline. Our influence was in decline. I don't know if you remember that. You're younger than I am, Michael, but I remember that very well. And then I remember the 80s, and I remember when Ronald Reagan came to office and the kind of shift in the mentality in this country and the willingness to call out the Soviets and stand up to them. And within 10 years of or it was a little over 10 years of their invasion of Afghanistan, where it seemed that we couldn't do anything to stop them, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And the economy, I studied in Moscow in the 80s. While people here thought the Soviet economy was very healthy, I could tell you it was not healthy. It was nothing near the U.S. economy. It was nothing near. They couldn't take care of their own people. And people started to realize that. I don't think it's realistic for Putin to think that he can keep the Russian people in the dark about the realities of the rest of the world, especially in today's world, given all the, social media, the internet. And I have said many times, one of my view is the president of the United States should start appealing directly to the Russian people to make it clear to them, I'm offering your president an end to this. I don't want a war. I want you to prosper along with the Ukrainians in peace. We want to do business, but if you want to do that, you need to tell your leadership they have to stop attacking their neighbors. And I think that will resonate with Russians. I think, the Russians are getting tired of this war. Even before the war, many Russians were saying, why are we, this is after 2014, why are we facing embargoes, sanctions, increasing isolation over a war with Ukraine? There's got to be another way to do this.
Yeah.
Right?
It just seems Putin is so dug in, and I don't know whether he's going to be able to pay a price. When you say there's increased infighting in Ukraine, and then I want to go to whether you have detected any changes in battlefield tactics from the Russians or the Ukrainians. But one last thing before we go there. When you talk to when you analyze and say there's infighting, is that just frustration with Zelensky? Is it about the tactics of the war? Is it just Zelensky's been in office for too long? I mean, where's it? Break it down for us.
It's a little of all that. I mean, there is a brigade commander just resigned from his position in Ukraine because he was frustrated with the leadership of the armed forces. There are people that are frustrated with the president. There are those people who are frustrated with how the system is working. We heard repeatedly, and this goes back over a year, we've heard that, the Ukrainians need to shift the mentality from the Soviet mentality of leadership to a more westernized, modern leadership example, both in the military and the government. There are, like in any country, including our country, there are clans or there are interest groups that have influence and they're fighting for more influence, key positions in the government. We heard stories of ineptitude, not so much corruption, but favoritism. Again, I don't think that is rare in any, having worked in the U.S. government for 34 years, there were plenty of times when officers would complain that someone's being taken care of because he or she is the favorite of this person or that person, or they're politically connected. So you have all of that in wartime. But I should stress, it's not at the level of like chaos or collapse. Things still work. We were in Kharkiv, which has been brutally bombed by the Russians. Things still work. Things are happening. People are on the streets. People are, out shopping. Students are going to school. So the country is not in collapse or in like major decay. It's kind of quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And by the way, I have to say this, Michael, I've never seen better gas stations in my life. The food in the Ukrainian gas stations is amazing.
I remember from when I was there. I think we had lunch there. So when you're downrange, not just in Kyiv and Lviv, Do you get briefings on the state of the military campaign? Are there new tactics that the Ukrainians have employed, or is this just a trench warfare, Russians, as everyone calls it, sending men in a sort of a meat grinder attack at the Ukrainians, and they eventually lose a trench or two, but it's attritional warfare? I mean, that's what I hear all the time. Is it more? There's got to be more to it than that, though.
There's definitely more to it. I think what we've really seen is the impact of FPV drones on the battle space. At any given time along the front, what we heard is that it's impossible to move more than 2 or 3 people together for any kind of tactical movement, because the drones are up there all the time from both sides.
Wow.
Right? There are drone swarms. There are semi-autonomous weapon systems being deployed. We heard, I think last time we were there in February, somebody briefed us that you have to get out of any kind of vehicle 14 kilometers from the trenches and move in small groups, 1 or 2 people, to get to the trenches. The Ukrainians are doing amazing things. Many of the people in our delegation who know what they're talking about praise the Ukrainians, saying you're probably well ahead of the U.S. in some of the tactics and the capabilities you've developed and the experience you have. But the Ukrainians are also very honest, saying the Russians are learning very quickly, and they're also doing a lot of things which are, very effective on the battlefield. One thing I will mention is we heard from several Ukrainian commanders that the North Koreans are, how would I say this? They're extremely dedicated.
They're still there.
They're still there. They're still fighting. They played a difference in the Kursk counteroffensive for the Russians. What the Ukrainians told us is they capture very few POWs among the North Koreans because the North Koreans refuse to surrender, and they'd rather shoot themselves than being captured. They're so, what's the word, like fanatical.
Yeah.
Right? Is that a right word? Can I say?
Sure. Yeah.
You're fanatics.
I think. Mm-hmm.
And that, by the way, we should pay attention to, and the South Koreans obviously have to pay attention to that, because they're training a whole group of combat veterans that will be better skilled at fighting wars in the future, including potentially on the Korean Peninsula.
So the nature of the drone warfare then is contributing to the trench warfare, attritional nature of the conflict, because no one can even begin to mount a large-scale offensive.
Yes, it's making it very, very difficult to move formations in large numbers.
It's been surprising to me all along, though, that the Russian military seems to not engage in terribly coordinated actions across the range of military options that they have. Is that accurate? I mean, why do I only hear about so-called meat grinder attacks where they send fresh troops in the hundreds at the same time?
Right.
And that many of them just get gunned down on their first go.
Unfortunately, I think that the Russian approach to this is, those soldiers are of little value to the Kremlin, right? And they're willing to sacrifice troops to try and take an objective in large numbers. So they are cannon fodder in many ways. And in many cases, we heard both during this trip and 2 of my previous trips, the Ukrainian commanders were saying that a lot of the Russians are also motivated to fight, not because they really want to fight, but because they're told, if you retreat, we'll shoot you in the head, which is an old tactic they used during the Second World War, when the NKVD would be behind the Russian troops on the front lines with machine guns and say, you're going forward. If you try and turn back, we will shoot you. So, we heard stories of Russian POWs captured by the Ukrainians begging not to be sent back to Russia based on their concern about what will happen to them. My understanding is that the Russians lost a lot of their command staff and, let's say, junior officers, mid-level officers early on in the war. And they're having a problem or challenge making up for that. They don't have experienced combat commanders because a lot of them were just sent in to die. That means that they don't have experienced officers to teach at their academies. They're looking for ways to address that, from what I understand. And we should be very, very cognizant of the fact that the Russians, I've seen this in my own career, the Russians learn very quickly from their mistakes. So we should never assume that they're completely incompetent and can't accomplish things. They can. They can be very technically capable, and they can learn very quickly on the battlefield. But so far, the Ukrainians have been able to keep up with them. And I think a lot of that's with help from the West.
So I knew they're capable of learning, but have they used the learning from these meat grinder attacks to switch it up a little bit? Did you see any evidence of that?
I have not seen a lot of evidence of that. I'm not going to say I'm a military expert.
Sure.
We were not briefed on that. What we heard from a couple of Ukrainians is like, we are incompetent, but fortunately the Russians are more incompetent. There's also a lot of infighting going on in the Russian system, especially, there's a lot of talk about fighting between the FSB and the Ministry of Defense. In some cases, there have been allegations that the Russians will allow, they are aware of Ukrainian, let's say, counterattacks, and they will allow, like the FSB will allow the MOD to fail because there's infighting in the, let's say the corridors of power in the Kremlin, and a lot of corruption. If you look at the Russian news, people are being arrested on a regular basis for corruption. And that is a problem which has always faced the Russians. And I would say, as far as corrupt as Ukraine can be, Russia is much more corrupt.
So, I don't want to be naive here, but what are the FSB, largely an intelligence service, and the MOD fighting about? Is it just Putin's ear? Is it the course of the war in the future?
Money.
I get it's just corruption.
Money, power, influence. I would say a lot of it is just money. Who controls the money flow? Who controls the defense industry? Who controls the contracts? Who's getting the benefit from those contracts?
So if MOD fails, FSB feels like it benefits because MOD looks bad and incompetent in front of the big boss.
Yes, almost the way that the Kremlin thinks that if the U.S. fails, it benefits. It's a zero-sum game.
It makes you really wonder, and I know this is a serious intelligence question, what kind of leader has Putin evolved to be? Is he refereeing between all of these fighting bureaucracies within Russia, or is he unwitting at the extent of their rivalries? Do you have any sense of that from your career?
Well, my guess is he encourages some of the rivalries. He uses it to, like the competition, to control things, to maintain some balance, to make sure that nobody else is too powerful to challenge him. People have said, Putin is a great leader. He's so brilliant. I always say, I don't think Putin is that smart. We have just failed to take him on when we've had the opportunity in the right way. For example, in 2022, we had a great opportunity to really press him when he made the strategic mistake of invading Ukraine, like the full-scale invasion, and we failed to take advantage.
We weren't ready. Yeah.
Right? I hope that the president today, who has been very critical of other presidents and their engagements with Putin, I hope that he can outwit, and I think he can. He can outlast and outwit Putin.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. I mean, I think you're painting a portrait of frustration, or at least some attritional warfare, maybe stalemate, infighting on both sides. Feels like Trump has felt that frustration between the two parties and is frustrated himself that he hasn't been able to broker a ceasefire, which could mean, as some of the newspapers in the last few days have pointed out, that indeed Trump may wash his hands of it all. But talk a little bit more about what Trump's opportunities are to outsmart Putin, because I don't know that I've heard that angle much.
Well, again, President Trump came to office. Okay, let's go back to 2016. President Trump campaigned on a policy of having a better relationship with Russia. He was not promoting himself as an enemy of the Russian people, right? He wanted to have a good relationship with the Russians. He tried. The Russians did not take advantage of it for a number of reasons. And we could go into like how they flubbed that opportunity, in my opinion. There were some problems here in Washington too, politically, domestically, that I think hamstrung the president, in my own view. But now he came back to office again, and he has put pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainians to come to the negotiations table. So he's tried to be, in my opinion, an objective, like not on the side of one party, my guess is because he's trying to get these negotiations going and he wants to be seen as a fair arbitrator. Putin has rebuffed him, has not taken the opportunity. In my opinion, this is just my view, but when he sends his officials to go meet with the Russians, let's say in the Kremlin or in Kiev, and the Russians continue to launch strikes on Kiev, that is insulting to the American people. That is a clear message to the American people that Putin does not respect us, and he is not going to take even a couple of days to stop his air raids to try and engage and find a way out of this disastrous war for both Ukraine and Russia. And I agree with the president, for the world. Like, we don't want this war. The Russian economy, as I said, is not doing well. The president of the United States has a much stronger economy. He has a much stronger industrial base. He has a much stronger military. He has everything that Putin doesn't have. And although Putin is trying to convince him that it's the opposite, I think the president can see through that. And, when president says, or people say the president's going to wash his hands of the negotiations, I don't know what that means. I mean, maybe we're going to say, I think they've said we're going to stop flying around trying to talk to the Russians and the Ukrainians if they're not going to talk in a sincere manner. I agree with that. I'm glad. My understanding is they canceled Steve Witkoff's travel to Moscow after Putin failed to show up in Istanbul. I think that is a smart move because we shouldn't be chasing the Russians, right? The Russians need to understand we are a superpower. We are the world's most powerful country. We want an end to this war, but we shouldn't bend our values to please them. We shouldn't appease Putin because he's the one that started this war, and he can end the war tomorrow if he just stops making maximalist demands. Like I understand today, again, they said they would enter negotiations if Zelensky was removed from power. That is not their choice.
Yeah.
Right? That is not
helpful. Yeah. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Glenn Korn.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Before we go back to active measures, and I want to hear about your experience with that, and then we'll close out. I think I need to press you. What are the chances that we would have a successful ceasefire, air, land, and sea, in the short to medium term? And I differentiate that, by the way, from a lasting peace agreement where there's security assurances and economic assurances, and you can get in the EU or you can't, etc. So just on a straight up ceasefire, do you think there's any shot of this in the short to medium term?
Short term, no. I mean, it depends on how you define the short term, but generally short term, no. Midterm, possibly. And my view is that if we start to enact the secondary sanctions, take some of the steps to send a very clear message to Moscow that we've had enough with them, their unwillingness to negotiate in a sincere manner, then Putin can be forced, or the people around him, to negotiate.
So maybe if we get some good sanctions going.
Not just sanctions, there are other things that we should be doing too to increase the pressure on Moscow, right? I mean, it's not just the secondary sanctions. Those will help. Keeping the price of oil down is critical. By the way, the president's trip to the Mideast, I think that was great for a number of reasons. I know if we can keep the price of oil down, that will help. And then there are other things that we can do, things that we did during the Cold War to undermine those people that were trying to undermine us and our allies.
So why do you think the Russians won't agree to a ceasefire? We see these suggestions by so many experts. It's because they think they're winning.
Right.
Could they really think they're winning? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I do think they can think they're winning. One, remember, there's like a echo chamber in the Kremlin and in the information space. And this has been a problem for a long period. The people around Putin don't tell him the truth. Like the Russian media doesn't tell the truth. By the way, we have to be careful of this in our own country. I don't want to get into like domestic U.S. politics, but this is something that people should be aware of. When you're towing the party line all the time, that's also not healthy for national security on a number of fronts, right? So this is what's happening in the Kremlin for years. Putin's hearing what he wants. He puts out a message and it comes back to him through different channels. And he says, look, I'm right. I'm so smart. Yeah. Right?
Right.
And I do think that the war, I wrote an article about this last year, that the war for Ukraine is actually being fought in the U.S., in the information space. And I think that the Russians probably feel that they have been able to manage or control the narrative here in the U.S. in many ways. I've been pretty critical of people like myself who've been unable to articulate effectively to the many Americans on why we need to help the Ukrainians, why it's in our best interest. It's not because I love Ukraine. It's because I love this country.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's that when you put it like that it's a war here in the United States, an information war, maybe they think they are winning, because it was a hell of a time last summer for Speaker Johnson to get the supplemental appropriations bill through the Congress. And I'm sure, just like everyone else that studies Washington is looking at the Congress and how things are going to play out towards the end of the year, that sees a even more difficult road to get additional assistance to the Ukrainians. So maybe the Russians are thinking to themselves, the Ukraine's going to run out of a lot of its military gear within a year or more.
They are definitely trying to convince the United States to end support, to influence voters, to influence leaders through different measures that they've traditionally used, not to continue support, to turn our backs on this, to give up, that it's hopeless, that they're in a position of strength, that Ukraine and the West are not. We just have to remember, in my opinion, you mentioned Speaker Johnson. If you remember when he went to Mar-a-Lago and President Trump, who was then candidate Trump, stood behind him and said he's doing a great job. To me, that was a clear message that President Trump was not going to block going forward with the aid package.
Yeah.
The Russians definitely wanted much more division in our last election. They wanted a closer election, and they wanted the American people to be at each other's throats. That did not happen. Voters went out, they voted. We had a peaceful process, a peaceful transfer of power. Now we have, you said 71 members of Congress ready to vote for this, for the sanctions package, the secondary sanctions that Lindsey Graham has developed. There are a lot of, by the way, President Trump has gotten the Europeans fired up, and he's awakened them in ways that nobody else has been able to do. They are now very, very focused on their own national defense, or, EU-wide defense, and helping the Ukrainians and doing more. Right? Since Putin started this war, NATO has expanded. It hasn't fallen apart. It hasn't collapsed. And President Trump is doing things, in my opinion, which are very smart. For example, he's engaging President Erdogan in a way that the previous administration really didn't do. His trip to the Middle East, again, I think was brilliant. What he did with the Syrians, I think, was very, very smart, because he's giving them hope. And of course, the message there is we don't want the Iranians and the Russians back into Syria. Like, work with us, don't work with our enemies. There are a lot of things that we should just remember that tell me that we can do this. And by the way, I served with Americans. I know Americans. I love this country. I love the American people. I think many people that voted last November didn't vote for appeasement for Putin. They voted for other things that they were tired of. But I think when most Americans have to decide, are we going to allow someone to continue to disrespect us and threaten us, which is what the Russians are doing now? No, we're not. Whether Republicans or Democrats, we are going to stand up for our country and our values.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about, as we begin to wind up, active measures campaigns. We had an earlier podcast a few months ago where I went through this with an expert on just what are the Russians trying to do across Europe? They tried to kill the head of a German defense contractor. There have been warehouses associated with military assistance that eventually ends up in Ukraine have been either blown up or targeted with fires and the rest. Talk a little bit about the Russians and their active measures, campaigns in the West. What's their motivation?
Their motivation is to destabilize and undermine the societies and the leaders, the politicians, the political leadership of the countries that they view are a threat to Russia. I've said this before. The Russians believe they're at war with the United States, right? And they are looking for ways to undermine this country. They're at the political level, they are looking for ways to drive division and anger among voters towards one another. They are looking for ways to discredit politicians in the eyes of the public, to discredit government institutions so people do not have faith in those institutions, to undermine faith in the military, law enforcement. They look for every opportunity to do that, and then they create scenarios where, like, they create false stories, or what they're very good at is inflaming and exaggerating the problems that already exist. Okay? They engage in sabotage. Yes, throughout Europe, we've seen them engaging in sabotage operations. They engage in cyber warfare, right? We've seen that in this country. The Europeans have seen it. If you ask the Ukrainians, that was one of the precursors to their start of the war in 2014. Serious cyber attacks against government institutions, financial institutions. So they have a number of tools that they use to, let's say in the what was very popular word now in the U.S. is gray space, but in a covert war scenario. And it's part of their doctrine. They are very focused on it. They've always had mechanisms inside the Soviet and then the Russian government, actually going back to the Tsarist times. If you know the story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a complete fabrication, that was created by the Tsarist Okhrana, right, for political purposes. So they have a long history of doing this. And, we're an open democratic society, and it's, some people say it's to their advantage, because they can get in and try and exploit fissures, widen fissures among Americans, among political leaders. They do whisper campaigns. They're clearly influencing people in the U.S. government or close, to the U.S. government to try and make them adopt their line. The line that, Putin is the victim here, that Russia is the victim, that NATO expansion was the reason for all this.
Right.
And they benefited by
Nazis in Ukraine,
biolabs, and they benefit from our lack of one, in my opinion, counter messaging, and two, like lack of education on these issues. People should remember that long before NATO started to expand in Europe, the Russians kept their troops in Moldova. They kept troops. They invaded parts of Georgia. They were in Nagorno-Karabakh. They were funding and encouraging war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So when the Russians act like they're victims, you need to know the story, the real story, right? That they're not innocent victims. Putin is not an innocent victim of the evil West.
All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. It makes sense, especially when you look at our politics. It makes sense when you think about Europe. If they can sabotage and murder, I can see European public saying it's not worth it for us to support Ukraine, and so support goes down, and politicians are irresolute. So all of that makes sense. Okay, now for the big question. For all that we've discussed about Russia's resilience, do you think they're just going to continue in this war for as long as Vladimir Putin is alive?
I do, unfortunately. At best, we may have a ceasefire. In terms of a lasting peace, I think as long as Putin is in charge, then there will not be a lasting peace. They will revert to, if they have to, the kind of covert action approach to try and destabilize Ukraine and other countries on their periphery.
So you dismiss this theory that, well, if Vladimir Putin continues to mismanage the economy and everything else, there could be a coup from the military or a coup from the FSB. You just dismiss that completely?
No, I wouldn't dismiss that. Anything's possible.
Okay.
Right? I would not dismiss that. People say,
but unlikely.
Well, people say, why hasn't it happened yet? And I'm, looking back at history, Vladimir Lenin was in Europe. I think he was in Geneva when the February Revolution happened in 1917. He was caught completely flat-footed because he told his cohorts around him, our grandchildren will not see any political change in Russia. We're not going to see it in our lifetime. And then a week later, the Tsar was abdicating, right? So you never know. Things can change very quickly. And I always say this about the Russians. They do have a breaking point. The Russian people have a breaking point, and they're human beings. And you can only, pardon me for saying this, crap on them for so long.
So the most likely outcome is that this keeps going until we have a succession away from Putin. And an option, seemingly unlikely, is that there's a coup that gets rid of Putin. When you look at the scenarios, and I'm just going to totally discount that a democracy pops up in Russia, when you look at the scenarios for a successor to Vladimir Putin upon his death, do you see another Intel type coming aboard that can keep all of these corrupt factions at bay becoming the president? Do you see, I don't know who, someone in the military? Do you see some other politician being able to tame this three-ring circus? What do you foresee?
I have no magic crystal ball. What I will say is that we, in my opinion, need to be ready to talk to people other than Putin. We need to, I say this sometimes, we may have to hold our nose and accept that someone that may take over the country is not exactly the person we would want. But we don't want to make the mistake we made in Iraq of having no plan, no leadership, no one to talk to. I think that would be a disaster. I agree with you, Michael. The chances of Russia becoming a democracy, a market-oriented democracy in our generation and maybe our kids' generation is not likely. Historically, it hasn't happened. But we could have a leader who is more predisposed to having a less confrontational relationship with the U.S., and there have been those leaders in Russian Soviet history that did see the value in having a less confrontational relationship. So, we shouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I had to guess that it would be another strongman type that could rise to the top. It continues as a kleptocracy with security factions more or less dominant, but no real reform. But they could decide that the war with Ukraine has gone on too long. To me, that seems maybe a plurality, not a majority in terms of likelihood, but seems maybe most likely.
And they realize that this war is benefiting China at their expense, right? The Chinese are buying up parts of Russia. And they have their eyes on, they don't see Russia as an equal partner. They have their eyes on a lot of Russia's natural resources, territory. So, and yes, we probably would have someone who is a strongman type, which is kind of going to be necessary to keep the country from collapsing. We're going to have a lot of our allies encouraging us to split Russia apart, to make it collapse, right? There's going to be a lot of debates, policy debates, and a lot of hard decisions that have to be made. And this is why I've been saying for years, for the last 5 or 6 years, we need to be engaging everybody we can in Russia, all future potential leaders. We shouldn't just close the door on anybody just because, they're Russians and we won't talk to them. That's my personal view, because we're going to have to deal with somebody. And, my own criticism of the U.S. is in the 90s, we had this very naive belief, like we've done in other places, that we could turn Russia into a market-based democracy in 5-10 years. And that backfired on us big time, right? It just wasn't realistic. If you knew Russian history and you knew what was going on in Russia on the ground, that was not realistic. And we kind of promoted by accident, in my opinion, the Putin regime. We could have had better.
Yeah. Glenn Korn, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters. Let us know the next time you're back from a trip to Ukraine, and we would love to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That was Glenn Korn. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please rate and review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.